Hey everyone, this is Kate from Moonflower Moments. Welcome and welcome back. Today I am joining y'all for my next installment of my 2025 Tarot Collection series. And today I'm going to share with you all of the decks that really have a more historical bend. As I go through the decks, I will also share with you if I have a particular practice or something that I do specifically with that deck. I will also share with you in those cases what I do with them and how I use them. So to get started, I will share with you my first one that I have picked out, and that is going to be the Old Style Tarot. Currently, I am using this for one of my daily draw decks, and I'm really fond of the guidebook for this one. I find that for cards such as Seven of Wands, and like yesterday's card was like Seven of Swords, cards that we tend to see from like a more negative point of view, the author really does a great job kind of neutralizing and then presenting some of the more shadowier aspects in the shadow section. So for example, this is Seven of Wands, and you can see there's a clear distinction between the upright and the reversed if you want to pause it to read it. So I found this to be actually quite a useful deck as like a little bit of a study deck to kind of break me from some of the more rigid reading points of view that I've gotten into. I think as we read for a long time, sometimes our understanding of the card can become more limited because we're so used to seeing a particular keyword work that we're associating with a card. And so I like working with guidebooks such as the Old Style Tarot guidebook to kind of help me neutralize some of those meanings and to take on different perspectives. I find the artwork to be very evocative. This is a deck too that I think the botanicals in the deck are really well thought of. So I really love that the Hanged Man has this tiny little flower here. So it kind of gives like a sense of kind of like grounding through the act of hanging. So even though he's hanging and his feet are not on the ground, he's still a little bit grounded to the earth, or he's still in the process of trying to take on that new perspective and apply it to the earth. And so I think it's a very interesting depiction, especially since this is a card that's typically associated with more unstable moments. Temperance here, gorgeous. And there are just lots of little botanicals everywhere. Like this almost looks to me like a vine that has taken a lot of generations to create. And so it really shows the longevity of this family living in this area. So this was the Old Style Tarot by Alexander Ray. It is a US Games deck. Next, I'm going to share another deck that I've been using in my daily draw envelopes, and that is going to be Cordana Emblemata. And if you've seen me talk about my daily draw practice, I have always kind of raved about how good the Lucille Clifton's Divining Poets Oracle works. And I have to go ahead and say that this deck is kind of like on par with that. I really appreciate some of these keywords. They're kind of more poetic in some ways, like the heart has its remedy, but love has none for the Three of Swords. That's a very potent phrase that's almost kind of like a verse listed straight from poetry. And then the artwork itself, because it is almost like very high contrast, is something that is very evocative. So using this in the morning is kind of like a dose of like really strong coffee. It kind of wakes you up. For the High Priestess, being a lone woman, I follow the Creator alone. So there is something uplifting and empowering about that. The Emperor, having a watchful eye for the execution of injustice. Beautiful. I believe that this deck is coming out mass market. So I'm really excited that more people will be able to experience it and use it, because this is one of my favorites of the historical decks that I have in my collection. Three of Cups in the delight of the gentle air. Just like very beautiful. And here are the backs of that one. That is Cordana Emblemata. Or Emblemata Cordana. I'm not sure which way it is. I've seen it written both ways. All right, next is going to be a deck by Libra Moon. I'm going to share with you, actually, honest to God, the most expensive oracle I've ever bought, and that is going to be Medieval Oracle of the Beast. But this is a chonker. Like, look how big this is. So you get plenty of cards for what you pay, is what I will say. I like this deck. I think it is very funny. A very funny reader. It goes along with almost every single historical deck that I'm going to show today. And so I think that Libra Moon was really smart in being able to identify a specific need that people have. And that people have all of these historical decks, but there are very few oracles that are being created around this theme. The creatures themselves are, of course, like medievally depicted creatures. And so many of them are not anatomically correct whatsoever. So this is a cat. So it brings like a little level of joy and kind of levity to my situation. Oftentimes medieval decks do tend to have a more like serious kind of bend just because of the nature of their artwork. And so I appreciate the way this kind of lifts up the reading. And I like to use it in particular because it almost kind of seems like very directive in a sense, like Ibex, climb to spiritual heights, or Ram, take charge of your life. I definitely like to use this to finish up a reading, to say, okay, what do I need to do moving forward? And in a sense, like these creatures almost become my spiritual allies in that way. I really love pulling cards that have creatures to be my spiritual allies, because it almost feels like that unicorn is kind of following me through my journey, or that Pegasus is kind of following me. And then I'm able to look for these creatures in the everyday life. In the case of like doves, like that is a very common creature, and just constantly kind of be reminded of that work that I'm doing. So this was Medieval Oracle of the Beast. Next, I have quite a good one. This is one of my absolute favorites I'm going to be sharing today. TarotTube calls this Cordana. Here is the name of the deck right here. I use this deck all the time for almost everything, period. One of the most used decks in my collection. So this deck isn't necessarily based on an RWS system or Marseilles system or Thoth system. It is a deck that is entirely unique in that way. So I really use this as what I consider to be one of my intuition lifters. So for example, this is the Three of Batons or the Three of Wands. And I can really kind of see, for example, that we perhaps are kind of moving in a direction upward, which is definitely true for the Three of Wands. It's definitely very expansive, kind of moving outside of yourself. And here we have this like little creature. So perhaps we are aiming to achieve kind of like this battle, and to feel a sense of like, that is what is driving us. It's like our ambition to battle this creature and the glory we might receive from it. And it adds like an extra layer every time I read with it too, because it really, I like to put this between two different tarot cards. I did share how I use this deck in depth in my 5 ways that I deepen a tarot reading video. So if you'd like to hear more about how I use this deck in practice, definitely head over to that. But there's a sense of freedom in working with this deck and knowing that it's not based on any particular system, and that I can let my intuition flow however I feel. So this is Cordana. And once again, here is the name if you need to look that up. All right, next I have a fun one. This is going to be the Golden Tarot of the Tsar. Yes, Golden Tsar Tarot. Golden Tarot of the Tsar. There we go. This is a Lo Scarabeo deck. I'm going to hold it up so that we can see it's like gilding and it's foiling in all of its beautiful glory. I also share a lot how I use this deck in my previously mentioned video, like 5 ways to deepen a reading. And I have a very specific practice associated with this deck, to where essentially before I see the front of the cards, I feel the back of them, and I try to kind of sense out what the energy of the card is before I even flip it over. And I find that this is another deck that really is kind of like an intuition, just kind of like builder for me. I like the artwork a lot. I do kind of like lovingly call it like the Jesus Tarot, because it is a tarot that definitely like features Jesus. But I found it to be a very direct and interesting reader overall. So this is the Golden Tarot of the Tsar. I think I'm going to etch this in red. Not that I needed to say this here, but I really need to get on edging this deck. I think it is time. And those Scarabeo decks are pretty easy to edge, I find. They take to the ink well. All right, next I have another one that calling it a historical deck might be a teensy bit of a stretch. But you're going to kind of see where I'm getting at here. I think it best belongs in this group. And this is going to be my Lord of the Rings Tarot. I've never seen Lord of the Rings. I've said that here before, but this is one of my favorite decks in the world. I love a good pip deck. I, as a matter of fact, adore a good pip deck. And so I like the way that this is featured. This deck kind of feels to me like, yeah, it's kind of historical, but it's kind of historical fantasy, like many of the fantasy books that I grew up reading. And so I really kind of like to lean into the idea of kind of like I'm on a quest with this deck. This is a deck that wants to go on adventures with me and it wants to quest. So I let it sit in my purse quite a lot. I take it for a lot of like get-togethers and like social gatherings. I've read for a lot of people with this deck because it feels to me that it's very like amicable and it wants to read for other people. Like it's definitely not staying at home. I think it gives like very accurate readings because the pip cards are so sparse. It kind of tells me what needs to be said right away without any of the extra fluff. And so I'm able to give readings pretty like efficiently with this deck as well. Lots of different pip cards. Here we go. Love the pips. Oh, we got a this is a crazy stretch of pips. There we go. The Ace of Rings. So this was the Lord of the Rings Tarot. Here are the backs. I probably need to edge this one too. Maybe not on this one. Maybe not. All right, next I have a deck that I aptly picked up at a Renaissance fair. So this is the Golden Tarot of the Renaissance. I'm gonna hold this one up too because it's another one of the low Scarabeo foil decks. I picked this up at a Renaissance festival and I just couldn't avoid it, right? It's the Renaissance Tarot. I'm at a Renaissance festival. And so for that reason, I will probably always hold on to this deck like very close to my heart. I bought it with a close friend of mine that we don't get to see as much anymore. So it has a very like specific memory attached to it for me. But this is a deck that is probably the least used in my tarot collection, point blank period. I've never really been able to find a way to work with it and to use it. I think that its interpretations are really interesting and unique. So for example, let's go ahead and pull some of the baton ones because those are the ones that get like a little bit strange. I'm looking at the batons. See, it's hard to even kind of read them because like the titles are all on the side. I'm looking. 1 second. So this is the Seven of Wands or batons, and I have a pretty creative memory and a pretty creative vision, but I have a very difficult time kind of seeing this as Seven of Wands as like holding your ground and protecting it and things like that. So it's perhaps that I need to just completely and entirely break free from RWS meanings and use this more as an oracle when I read with it. To me, this guy seems like really sad and kind of sullen, like he's almost given up the fight entirely. So the fight has already lost, like he's already lost it, and he knows that his sheep or his dog, I guess it's a dog, I don't know why I said it was a sheep, is about to be slaughtered because he has no food for it or something like that. So perhaps that's what needs to be done. I did get this deck pretty relatively early in my reading journey. I think I had been reading for only like a year at that point. So I think my relationship might be different with it now that I have a little bit more experience. So I just kind of need to give it a go. So if you have this deck, I would love to know what you use it with or what kind of readings you do with it, and in general, how it reads for you. Like, is it a good reader for you or is it more of a difficult one? This Two of Cups really kind of disturbs me because it looks like she is not willing to, she doesn't look like she wants his advance. So I definitely forgot that this card was in there and I don't like that card at all. Woo, glad that I remembered that that was there. So now I can remember why I don't use it as much, but that was the Golden Tarot of the Renaissance. It's definitely probably safe in my collection, but I mean, I either need to reconcile with the fact that I'm never going to use it and I'm just going to perhaps like display it on one of my new shelves or find a way to use it. All right, next, let's go ahead and grab William Blake. I think this does have a more historical lens because William Blake was depicting an artwork that gives that sense. There's something just so right about putting William Blake down on my table, and like, I love it. As many of you know, this is one of my favorite decks of all time. If I had to honestly rank it right now, I would probably put it at like number 2 or number 3. It's very high up there. I have a whole walkthrough of this deck in which I go through and share my relationship with the cards. So if you're interested in that, I will leave that in the description box below. This is the deck that really just kind of fills me the most with movement. I really love reading the poetry that is on these cards. It kind of reminds me to take action in my own life. Every man's wisdom is peculiar to his own individuality. I've done a lot of work around that card. And I do find that this deck is certainly a fiery reader. It kind of like wants to kind of spit a message in your face, kind of wants to kind of slap you with that message. And then it's your job to kind of go back and integrate that message into your own life. This is not a deck that minces words. It's not an easy reader, I will say, especially because the suits are kind of switched up. So even though this has a fire border, the music suit is actually cups. This looks like it would be earth, but the poetry suit is actually fire. And then the fire here is actually going to be water. Whereas the swords, I mean, I'm going to get to a swords card so you can see. Sorry for flipping through so fast. The swords actually, you know, they're science, so that actually makes sense. This is the only suit that like makes sense in this deck. And I just have it memorized that the suits are switched. I love this deck enough to where I'm willing to put in some work with it, so it doesn't bother me too much. But this is William Blake. Y'all have heard me talk about it before, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I will put a link to my walkthrough down below if you would like to see more of my thoughts about this deck in detail. All right, next I have one of the decks that probably taught me that I love historical decks, and this is going to be the Serpent and Peacock Tarot. I have the first edition, and I'm so fond of this very, I'm gonna put it down because the cardstock is super slippery, this very like wacky, kooky ass deck. This was the first edition, and the creator of this deck writes in the guidebook that they were more of an astrologer and they were interested in how astrology relates to tarot. So some of the more like conventional meanings of the tarot cards are not really displayed in these cards, but instead they're kind of displayed from an astrological bins. And I am well studied, I'd say, in how astrology applies to tarot for the most part. So I'm able to kind of glisten the meaning and get where it's coming from. But it's interesting because it definitely is still related to a system. It's just not related to like a traditional RWS in some cases. Now, in later editions, the creator did go back and revise to make the cards fit a little bit more clearly. But in this deck, it still kind of like has its like kooky like weirdness. The collage work was definitely in some of its earlier stages. So for example, this is the 6 of Cups. And in the revised edition, I believe that the child is actually receiving some flowers from another individual's. So it's a little bit more of like a childhood scene and less about like toiling and work and things like that. But this deck makes me laugh. It makes me absolutely just gobsmackingly laugh. Like, I don't know what's going on half the time. I think it's kooky and it's weird and it has like a personality, and this is my favorite magician of all times. I really think it shows the trickster energy of the magician so gloriously and gorgeously. And like, look at these little feet. So she's a good one. I have thought about getting some of the later editions, but I feel like all of the quirks in this edition kind of help keep its charm. And I'm so bonded to this deck. This used to be one of my all-time favorite decks. It's not anymore, but it's just, I have massive love in my heart for it. Next, I have another one that might be a little bit of a stretch to include here, but that is going to be the Goddess Tarot. I'm going to consider this one to be a little bit historical leaning, just a teensy bit, because of the way that it features goddesses from historical cultures. So that's my reasoning. That's my logic. That is what it is. In my mind, it definitely worked. This was one of the first tarot decks that I ever got. This deck sings for me like nobody's business. I love to use this deck for divination in terms of future reading and reading for the future. I really get this deck. There's something that like very tangible that happens when I read with it, where a card comes out and I know exactly what it's trying to tell me every single time, even if the message is so totally different from the ways that I've seen that card in the past. So this deck is deeply treasured in my collection, so much that I decided to actually purchase another deck by this creator. And I believe this is, let's see, it's a US Games deck by Chris Walder. And the other deck that I have by her is going to be the Lovers Tarot. And I have this cute little bag for it. We have the sun and the moon, which are of course the lovers. And I'm going to consider this to be a historical bending deck as well for the same reasons, in that the courts feature historical features, historical people from folklores and myths and just stories in general. It features mythology, features pretty heavily in this deck. There's also something about the very ornate borders to this one, whereas the Goddess Tarot has like more simplistic borders. This one clearly is a little bit more ornate. I haven't used this one a lot because I just got it into my collection pretty recently, but I have used it for what it's, I think, intended for, which is for love readings. And I found it to be scarily accurate. I've really enjoyed learning about these individuals that are listed on the cards. They're also discussed very briefly in the guidebook. So I know this isn't one that gets its time on TarotTube, but I really enjoy it. So this was the Lover's Path Tarot. All right, guys, we are almost there. We just have 4 more left. Next, I have my historical Marseilles, and this is the CBD Tarot. I used to use this deck constantly, all the time, actually. I really had a period of time when I first started YouTube, I think, that I was like really studying Marseilles pretty heavily. I've kind of stepped away from that, but I really want to get back more into it. And I really can say that, honest to God, this is an excellent example of a Marseilles. I feel like the way that the cards are described in the guidebook absolutely makes sense. I also have another book called the Marseilles Tarot Revealed by the creator of this deck. And pairing that book with this deck in particular really helps me to get an understanding of where these meanings come from. So for example, the 3 of Pentacles here, I'm going to show in the guidebook. And here's what it has to say about that. So it's 3 of Coins. Product, a partnership, or an alliance bears fruit. First results of a project, good prospects. So we can see that these two individual coins are kind of partnered together, and here we go, we have bared a fruit. Now, in the book that I had suggested, which is the Marseilles Tarot Revealed, it'll go into the fact that some of these tendrils, I guess, are kind of wrapping around this new coin, and so like things are still being like freshly developed, it's still being protected, but there is kind of an act of creation occurring. So I like that the book itself just describes the placement and kind of the symbology of all of the things that to many people just kind of look like decoration, but are really intentionally put there. So this is the CBD Tarot. All right, next I have one that I think appropriately landed on this list, and that is going to be the Influence of Angels Tarot. This is another US Games deck. There we go. I really like this cardstock. It's a good linen. Whoa, there we go. So I've actually used this deck for a couple of specific purposes. Where I live, people really do believe in like guardian angels and spirit guides. That's a pretty regular part of people's faith here. So when I'm reading for someone who has more Christian leanings, I found that working with this deck and referencing the angels that they believe in, the angels that I believe in, really helps us to help create a message that both parties can really latch onto and deliver a meaning that makes sense to everyone involved. The guidebook on this is absolutely wonderfully fantastic, like super good. This is a deck that I would definitely purchase if I was interested in learning more about numerology. I find the artwork to be extremely compelling. I haven't used it much for myself. Like I said, this has really kind of been regulated as a client reader, but I think I absolutely could use it for myself and it wouldn't be a problem at all. It's a very easy reader for me. So this was the Influence of Angels. And then we just have 2 more. The next one is going to be my Climpmp Tarot. And while this isn't necessarily medieval historical, I definitely think that because this features Climpmp's artwork, it can be rightfully included here. So this is a series of a kind of like curated art by Climpmp. I used this deck constantly when I first got it, absolutely constantly when I first got it. And then I kind of like brought in new decks, and this is one that's been a little bit neglected for a little while. But I want to tap my toes back into it because it's one that really helps my intuition to sing. This is, for example, the 3 of Swords, which is not your typical depiction of just a heart. And so I have to kind of take more time to sit down and study the artwork. And so I find that my readings with this deck end up being like very intentional and very meaningful for that reason. 4 of Swords, you can see the connection there. 4 of Cups, look how she's kind of like grasping her heart, like she's not sure where to go next. I'm a sucker for the gold foiling too. There we go. So this is the Climpmp Tarot. And then one more to share with you is going to be my Shakespeare Oracle. This one is out of print. I think you can still get it for a pretty reasonable price. For a while, it was kind of soaring up to the 300s, but it looks like the market value on this has kind of crashed a bit. So I think you can still get it for a pretty reasonable price. I mean, here we go. I love this. I love using this deck on next to candlelight. It really shines so well with that. So I am an English teacher, and so there's something really warm and kind of cozy about wrapping myself up in the world of a Shakespeare play, reminding myself of all the nights that I studied them when I was getting my degree, all of the curriculum work that I have done and that I still need to do to plan out units. But I like this deck quite a bit. You know that I'm a big fan of pips here, so the pips don't bother me at all. In the guidebook, it actually goes pretty well into how the quote symbolizes the nature of this card meaning. For the courts and for the majors, which are more scenic, it actually gives you like a little bit of the story, so you can actually see how Hermione, for example, is related to the Queen of Chalices. It does kind of share that story in a summary for you, and then it also kind of gives you an interpretation of how that applies to your life. So even though the deck is based off of some pretty obscure like Shakespeare plays and characters, like I consider myself to be pretty well read in Shakespeare, and a lot of these cover like the historical tragedies, which are not ones that are typically like studied and taught. We tend to study more of just the tragedies. So I kind of like that this has like a more kind of like diverse representation of Shakespeare's work, and helps me to become like a little bit more knowledgeable about other plays. All right, so that was the last one that I have to share with you guys today, and we did this for under 30 minutes. Look at that. So I appreciate y'all so much being here. I will leave links in the description box below to everything that I said that I would, and I will also leave a link to this playlist too if you want to check out the other videos in this series. So I hope that y'all have a great day. Thank y'all so much for watching.